The Beginnings of the Mirhala War, a summary of excerpts taken from the Osages. These excerpts are traditionally read at the beginning of Mirhala. Dakor, the living shadow, lamented at his gloomy fate, the long ages of dwelling in the abyss below the world. Although this was his realm, and in it he had great size and strength, he longed to escape the eternal darkness and ascend to the heavenly realm of Averia, for he had once been of the Everin race, and had once known the celestial comforts and pleasures. Yet as the living shadow he was an enemy to the Everin, and would not be welcomed by them if he ever returned. Therefore he resolved that he would need to defeat them, if Averia was ever to be his own. Driven by his desire of what lay above, Dakor escaped the abyss and climbed up to the mortal lands of the world. Yet he suffered a grave consequence, for in the light of the sun he lost his size and strength and shrank down into the smallest of shadows. In this form he travelled secretly throughout the settlements of humankind and created discord among the people, whispering of fears and sinful desires to them while they slept. Dakor collected the growing amounts of humankind's sin and fear, and took the supply deep into the forest of Creed, where he poured sin onto a vine that in turn grew into a giant thorny knot. Out of the knot came the first Draymorns. The centuries passed, and the Draymorns spread out across the world. At first they were seen as no more than vermin that stole animals away from the herds tended by humankind, but then they became more dangerous, attacking villages and eating people. Seeing what the Draymorns had done, humankind came to understand that the creatures were created from the evils of people. The fear grew, and Dakor drank it in, and from it he regained the great size and strength that he had once possessed in the abyss. Shrouded in dark thunderclouds, he roamed the lands, seeking out the Draymorns and gathering them up unto himself. When he revealed his sword to them, the earth-edge of dusk, which flashed like darkened lightning, the Draymorns bowed before him in fear. Having mustered his armies, Dakor prepared to make war on Averia, and looked to the passage, the great light that once shone from Averhorn Tower, and served as the gateway between mortal lands and the heavens. Chapter 4. The Flight of the Ariatheas. Yet Dakor and his armies did not go unchallenged. There were those who did not fear him, and barred his way to the passage light. The legenders gathered and did battle with him. King Mercius, the king of Tierion, spoke to an audience of thousands that had gathered in the city's amphitheatre. Like his ancestors before him, Mercius read the legend of the Mirhala War to initiate the festival. He stood tall, imposing before the crowd, and carried a pensive look on his face as he read. The grey that flecked his mane and beard showed that he was in the middle of his years. The garland of golden leaves that adorned his head and his golden robe with patterns of vines and branches weaved into the fabric gave him the look of a tree changing colour and making ready for the winter. It was late summer all around the king, but his autumnal appearance gave him further distinction as a man who pondered long on ancient and forgotten things. He read to the multitude before him, telling of how the legenders confronted the Draymorn horde, how the legenders fought using great beasts formed out of the elements, heavy-footed land beasts formed from stone, great birds of prey formed from the wind, dagger-fanged predators formed from fire, and massive coiling serpents formed from water. In a mighty collision of fire and rock, water and blood, the legenders routed the Draymorns and drove them back. But Dakor reformed his armies and commanded them to attack again and again, marching ever toward Tierion and the passage light that once glowed atop the Averhorn. It was not a single battle, but a long war that spread over many lands, for Dakor grew to lust after the world on which he fought. He built fearsome strongholds on the land he took, and raised grisly monuments to himself whenever he had a victory. For 40 years the legenders tore down the strongholds, and kept back the advancing hordes. The legenders were mighty and powerful, but their numbers were few and could not be replenished. The Draymorns, however, only grew in number, spawning from the dungeons that Dakor had carved out of the depths using his great sword, the Earthage of Dusk. It was this sword that proved the greatest bane to the legenders, for when they sent forth their elemental beasts, Dakor would fell the shapes with a stroke of his blade. Rock crumbled and fire fell to ash. Therefore the legenders were pushed back, footstep by scraping footstep, all the way to Tierion, where they made their final stand. The world was devastated, and humankind had fled to the caves in the mountains. They had seen the fear that Dakor had brought with him, and so they hid in the dark and waited for the war to pass. Yet as the smoke began rising up around the walls of Tierion, young Mirhalla dared to go outside and gaze long in the direction of the city. When he grew sufficiently restless, he returned to the caves and hammered out for himself a large bell. He then carried the bell up to a lofty crag and rang it loud. At its sound, his people came out from hiding, and Mirhalla cried down to them, "The fate of the world will not be decided by the battle of good against evil, but by the choice to do good or do nothing. Therefore I will not hide in the dark and watch our world end. Today I march to where I see the smoke rising, where the legenders are fighting, and I pray you come with me so that we can join them in their final stand. Do not be afraid. The enemy carries fear, but we carry an edge that is sharper and more enduring. Do you not love your women? Do you not care for your sons and daughters? Even the smallest creature will make it stand between its young and the Hagwar's jaws. To some creatures, Ahatho gave horn and antler. To others he gave a sturdy leg and a kicking hoof. To man he gave wit and heart, and he will deliver our enemies into our hand. Therefore march with me, and see if Ahatho does not bring the Draymorn armies low and feed the soil with their dead." And so the men rallied to young Mirhalla, and marched with him to Tierion. Yet as they marched, the legenders had come into despair. Most of their number had been slain, and the hordes of Draymorns stood vast before their gates. Many believed that one final responsibility remained, to set the passage free so that Dakor would not have an entry into Averia. The legender Osira did not agree. She urged the other legenders to believe that Ahatho would not yet abandon them, that there was a better end in store. The others, however, did not share her hope, and therefore opened the columns atop the Averhorn and let the passage light go free. And as the light rose and disappeared into the heavens, there came the tolling of a bell. With it came the charge of mortal men, for Mirhalla came down from the hills and into the battle, changing the balance of the war in an instant. Osira's hope came to be the truth after all. "And this is why we are here today," said Mercius. "We are here to remember that hope, and those who fought for our salvation. For Ahatho blesses those who remember, and curses those who forget." When he finished reading, he delicately and reverently closed the Osages before him, for it was ancient, and its pages were as brittle as dried leaves. It had supposedly been written by Lyron's own hand, and that made it more valuable to Mercius than any other treasure in his vault. He slowly crossed the amphitheatre's stage and looked up to the balconies where the kings and queens of the other nations sat. Towering over the audience were 3 giant statues depicting celestial women, female Everin, each holding a balcony in the palm of her hand, one for each of the nation's leaders. Morris sat on the balcony farthest east with Heron and her guard to accompany her. Roosts had been built on the statues' wrists especially for the festival, and when the Ereatheas perched on them, it looked as if the statues wore living bracelets. "Queen Maris Elamor," King Mercius called out, "daughter of King Malfin." No matter how crowded the amphitheatre may have been, the acoustics made his voice fill the space between the flat circle stage and the balcony where she sat. "The poet Nalius once said, 'Whether under the flashing azure or haunting grey sky, the sea and its ways always hold men's eyes.' You come to us from the far northern shore, and as you entered, I saw your beauty hold the eyes of many men." His words were meant to compliment her, but he delivered them with such seriousness that they held little charm. Maris bowed her head respectfully. "You have taken your father's place," continued Mercius. "Know that Tierion mourned him." Though she was reminded of her father's passing, she remained expressionless. His death had not brought her sorrow. Mercius went on to greet the leaders of every nation. He also administered judgments as he went. "King Caar Morcast of Derisium, and King Grexus Terrelorn of Patara. The rivalry between your 2 nations is no secret. It is an old thing, older than the borders of your lands, but it is foolish as it is old. My ancestors dealt with the same dilemma between your kingdoms, and still there is no peace." It seemed that there were land disputes between the lords that lived on the borders of Derisium and Patara, disputes ripe enough to turn into violence if not resolved. King Mercius ordered the offspring bond, which meant that each of the Derisan lords would send their eldest son to live with one of the Pataran lords for 1 year, and the Pataran lords would do the same with their eldest sons. These adopted sons were to be given the same treatment as the blood children of the lords' houses, and the adopted sons were to respect their surrogate fathers. After the year was over and the offspring bond finished, the lords were to hold an outdoor feast between their lands where sons would return to their own fathers. At this feast, the lines between their lands would be discussed and redrawn. Once Mercius gave his order, there was no doubt the kings would see them through. Mercius's domain may have been smaller than theirs, only the city and its surrounding land, but the king of Tierion had the most powerful voice of all. If another king mishandled his allegiance with Tierion, there would be dire political effects, and the ramifications could even mean justice from the heavens. A disobedient king risked bringing drought or famine upon his land, while an obedient king surely brought the blessing of abundant harvests. But the minds of the audience were far from politics and the future of their lands. They were anxious for what was to come that day, and restlessness spread throughout their numbers contagiously. The Ereatheas caught the worst of it. Their tails switched back and forth impatiently, and they anxiously flapped their wings from time to time, sending powerful gusts into the crowd. Once Mercius finished speaking with the kings and queens, he finally announced what everyone had been waiting for. "Bring out the bell!" The crowd roared their approval, and the Ereatheas flapped their wings even stronger than before, barely able to keep their toes on their perches. 2 men carried a large bell out onto the stage and set it next to the king. It was Mirhalla's bell, the one he had used to rally his men, a bell roughly smithed in a time when humankind was exiled to the wilds, and so it was devoid of symmetry, and the sides were pocked and bumpy. The Ariatheas, however, stared at the bell as if it were made entirely out of precious stone. A robust man, the medallion hanging from his neck marked him as the head official of the flight, followed the bell onto the stage and called the competitors to their places. Maris smiled at Halareth and patted his paw. He nuzzled her shoulder before he left. With a leap off their perches and a short glide over the audience, the Ariatheas landed on the stage. It was just large enough to hold all of them. Side by side they faced east and formed a starting line. The official announced the names of each of the competitors, their breed, and the nation for whom they flew. Talagos, the Crimsonari from Tertia. Esu, the dusky grey from Umberia. Werasi, the ashcoat from Derisium. Quenyol, the snowtail from Anshaw. Solanon, the amberin from Patara. Halarith, the sea stripe from Havamir. The head official then went on to give the rules for the flight. The Ariatheas were not to use violence or aggression, and they had to stay within the boundaries marked out by the red banners. Breaking any of the rules would result in immediate disqualification. The first competitor to pass in front of the stage after 10 laps around the city would win their land Mirhalla's bell. The nation with the bell would take the seats of honor throughout the festival, but more importantly, they would have 5 years of justified boasting. "On the third toll you may begin," the head official announced. The honours of beginning the race belonged to the King of Tierian, so Mercius took the mallet and struck the bell once. The Ariatheas creased their eyes in concentration. The bell tolled a second time, and the crowds held their breath. The Ariatheas crouched, with every muscle taut as though they prepared to make the eastern sky their prey. A final swing of the king's mallet, and the bell made its third toll. The Ariatheas launched off the ground in a rush of beating wings, pushing themselves into the air with hurricane strength and thunderous snorts that blasted from their nostrils as they heaved themselves forward to gain good position. The crowds leapt to their feet to see the Ariatheas pass the first tower with a red banner waving on top. The thousands and thousands of voices roared and resounded as people cried out the names of their Ariatheas. The amphitheatre pulsed with life and colour as a myriad of national banners waved throughout the multitudes. Maris longed to join the sound and movement of the crowds below, but her position as queen would not permit it. She had to remain composed. Tapping her hand anxiously against the parapet, she looked to the other queens on their balconies and saw that they were as rigid as the statues that held them. Maris could only whisper her cheers, but they were just as impassioned as the shouts of those below. The Ariatheas weaved their way in and out of towers at a breakneck speed. Halareth flew in third, behind Solanon in second, and Werasi in the lead. Werasi swerved back and forth, preventing both Solanon and Halareth from pulling in front of him. Werasi cut in for a close turn on one of the course banners, while Solanon tried to pass him on the outside. Solanon's pull to the outside gave Halareth an opportunity to get directly behind Werasi, but Werasi's tail came in too close to the spire and clipped the red banner from its place. Halareth caught the banner on his face so that it covered his eyes. Blinded, Halareth pulled up above the race so he would not crash into any of the towers. He hovered there for just the moment he needed to tear the banner from over his eyes, and once he could see again, he shot down from the sky and continued the race. His mischance put him in last place, so he gritted his teeth and mercilessly pushed his muscles onward, beating his wings fiercely. Gleaming with sweat, he regained his speed and passed Quenyol like a tempest. In the turret, Arcos observed the races with mild interest. The other half of his attention he gave to preparing bones. Most had already been cleaned. He would then study them to figure out what he would make of them. Before every carving, Arcos would begin with a rough idea of what he wanted. Yet while he carved, he bargained with spontaneity and let the result of each cut help determine the outcome of the finished piece. After he finished carving and smoothing, he would then set to polishing with the oils on his fingers until his creations gleamed. While he was cleaning the bones, he noticed a creever web hanging in the corner of one of the windows. The creever, a creature no bigger than one of Arcos's buttons, swung from thread to thread with spindly limbs and shook the dew from the web as it went. Occasionally the creever would strip the dew off the gossamers with its tail and then bring it to his pincers for a drink. Arcos paused from his craft and studied the delicate intricacies of the web, one craftsman admiring the work of another. There was also a dinnypike hive on the turret's ceiling, and a red dinnypike, its body a thumb's length, crawled out of the hive and buzzed its wings madly. It flew a few mad circles around the turret and then went right into the web as if to break through, but one of its wings got tangled in the strands. No matter how much it thrashed about, it could not free itself, and it tangled the web into ugly knots. The creever scrambled to the edges of what remained of its web and tried to find a way to pull in the dinnypike, but the little creever could never capture such a large insect. Arcos's carving knife flew across the turret room and pinned the dinnypike to the wall. Stuck, the dinnypike angrily chewed on the blade with its pincers and stabbed wildly with the spike on its head, the weak venom leaking out of its tip. Arcos retrieved his knife, letting the dinnypike fall to the ground where he crushed it with his foot. He looked for the creever, but it had fled into a crack somewhere in the wall. As the Ehretthiers made another pass around the turret, the ruined web shivered in the wind. Then Arcos heard a dire urgency come from the winds passing. The air howled. It was calling him, for something was very wrong. An evil thing had come into the city. The crowd below Maris was just as tumultuous as it had been when the race began. She gripped the balcony's parapet with all her might and leaned out from her seat as much as propriety would allow. Rossi still held the lead, but he was growing tired, and the distance between him and the others was shrinking. Solanon remained in second, and Hallerith had fought his way back to his former position in third place. He had the speed to be second, but Solanon kept flailing his tail back and forth so that Hallerith could not pass. Hallerith gained some daring as they passed the amphitheatre and tried to slip through Solanon's right, but Solanon's tail cracked him hard across the jaw. The force of the blow would have knocked a weaker creature out of the sky, but Hallerith shook his head and continued onward. The Havamirians roared in anger and howled out their rulings to the head official, but he acted as if he saw nothing and ignored the crowd. It took all of Maris's strength not to yell out and curse the official. On the other side of the city, the cloaked figure climbed staircase after staircase in the empty observatory tower, his footsteps and slender staff clicking echoes as he went. When he reached the final stair of his climb, he leaned against the wall, wheezing and grunting in unnatural sounds. Once he caught his breath and found his bearings, he went straight to the doorway of the top floor. The door was heavy and sturdily built, yet had a lock that was easy to pick. The observatory was a large circular room with a hole in the dome ceiling that opened up to the sky. The wall was covered in a mosaic that charted out important constellations, and the sky glass and other golden instruments for viewing the stars sat out on the white stone table in the center of the room. All of the instruments could have made the cloaked figure a small fortune, but he was there for a purpose other than theft. He went to one of the windows and stepped outside onto the ice-glazed ledge barely wide enough to hold his rag-covered foot. Very slowly, he shuffled along the footholds of the ledge until he reached the corner of the tower, where a massive gargoyle leaned out over the city. Suddenly, a powerful gust of wind threatened to knock him off his perch, but the cloaked figure fell to his knees and gripped the gargoyle's back. The Areotheas raced past, less than a stone's throw away. Once the violent winds of their passing had died down, the cloaked figure quickly went to work. Out from under his cloak, he pulled a black cord and strung it to the ends of his slender staff so that it became a bow. Then he produced an arrow and a vial from secret pouches in his coverings. He uncorked the vial and smelled it. Even with the mask and all the wrappings over his face, the vapour still stung his nostrils and caused him to jerk his head back in revulsion. He dipped the arrowhead into the vial, and something like dark tree sap stuck to the point. He then placed his arrow on the string. It did not take very long for the Areotheas to make their next pass. Wayrossi remained in the lead, with Solanon and Halerith following close behind. With only one lap left, Halerith made the push to get past his two remaining opponents, but whenever Halerith tried to slip through an open pocket, Solanon's tail would be there to bat him away. Up ahead of them lay a bridge between two towers. Underneath was a small arch barely wide enough to fit an Areothea. Wayrossi and Solanon went above the bridge, but Halerith took the risk, closed his wings, and dove under it. His feathers grazed the walls on either side, but he made it through, and not only did he overtake Solanon, but he also moved right up next to Wayrossi. As the Areotheas turned the last curve, the amphitheatre came into sight. Seeing that the end of the race drew near, the creatures called upon whatever reserves of strength that still remained. Both Wayrossi and Halerith huffed and puffed for air. The price of being in the lead had taken its toll on Wayrossi, since he had acted as a shield for the others to draft behind. Halerith was in a similar state, having spent most of his energy making up for the position he lost in the beginning. His body cried out for rest, but when he glanced at the balcony ahead where Maris sat, the moment halted still, and he could see the pride she had for him glowing on her face. Time burst into motion once again. Suddenly he no longer felt the pains of his exertion, and with easy breaths he pulled into the lead. But it was in that moment an arrow laced with poison hurtled through the sky.